today I'm going to talk about certain foundational KPI and some thoughts. It's a little thought-provoking. I like writing about these, as someone mentioned before. Am I on the right slide? Let me see. OK. I have this tagline on LinkedIn, "Your friendly neighborhood UA guy," and I just like to think about these important topics and look at them from different angles. Because we've been in the industry for a long time. The industry is also getting older, and we have to think about different ways how to measure, optimize, and ultimately make money for the companies we represent. So when you think about my role, and my role is I'm a senior director of user acquisition at Zynga. I'm overseeing UA for a few studios. It's like anywhere between 15 and 25 games. Yes, it's managing the team. It's managing the relationship with the MMP, with partners, with leadership in the company. But a lot of time, it's literally plumbing, which means that I have to look into pipelines, understand where the data is coming from, and understand where the discrepancies are coming from. And as the industry is getting older, we're seeing more and more issues with discrepancies and more issues with data quality. And we're trying to kind of reconcile these different data points and understand how do we measure things in the best possible way. So with that, I'm putting my plumber hat on. And for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be super Nebo. And I'm going to talk about discrepancies and how discrepancies evolved over time and how we can get better at eliminating discrepancies and understanding how to measure our UA performance. So let's start with the evolution of discrepancies. So one thing that we don't talk enough about is that the industry is maturing. And as a result of the industry maturing and as a result of a maturing portfolio of games, in my case, the install profile is changing, meaning that we have some of the most iconic games that have been built 10, 15 years ago, like Zynga Poker, Words with Friends, et cetera. I mean, if you look at the top grossing charts, games like Clash of Clans or Candy Crush, they're 10+ years old. So new installs are not really just new installs. They are reinstalls, they're reactivations. The install profile is changing. And this also means that we need to change how we measure our campaign efforts and, again, how we optimize things. Then the second reason, and probably the reason we talked about and wrote about a lot in the past few years, are privacy-related updates. With the loss of user-level signal, with all the changes that happened in specific countries, like age gating in the UK, or specific regulations in Brazil and California, CCPA and CCPR, et cetera, it's just getting harder to get that user-level signal and to understand, again, where the install is coming from and how to measure and attribute accurately both installs and spend for specific campaigns. And at the same time, while all of these things have been changed in the past few years or a decade, we haven't really changed install definitions. Still, an install is a new install in most cases. Maybe we have installs internally, first-party installs that are not necessarily aligned with MMB installs, which is where the discrepancies come from. But we're still looking at CPI the same way. We just divide spend with installs, and that's, in theory, CPI or eCPI, depending on how you look at it. So yes, I might be a little crazy, but I'm here today to talk about CPI. It's a blast from the past. We're here, it's 2010, and we're going to talk about how to optimize campaigns towards CPI. I'm kidding a little bit. I'm trying to make this a little engaging. So let's try to dive into these discrepancies, where they're coming from, and learn how can we optimize our reporting stack and how we can work with MMPs, improve our single source of truth solutions in order to just measure things better and, again, optimize things in a slightly smarter way. So as I mentioned, games are getting older, which means that install types are changing. So we identify 4 different install types, and they can come from organic efforts or from paid efforts. And we're starting with the first one, just installs. So 15 years ago, I started my career in 2013 in mobile gaming. We just assumed that every single install is a new install. Very simple. Spend divided by installs, you get CPI. And then retargeting became a thing. So we started measuring reinstalls. We tried to bring some users back, and then retargeted reinstalls became a thing. So then we had 2 things. It's a little more complicated. And then 5 years later, we realized reinstalls are not just part of retargeting efforts. Reinstalls are also part of UA efforts, and we need to measure and attribute that properly. So things are getting slightly more complicated. But with reinstalls, it's still fairly easy because you do get an install postback, so you can measure that using your MMP. Then we started looking at into reactivation. So in case the app is still on the phone, there's no install postback, someone opens the app. So like you have to understand this use case as well. So someone has the app on the phone, they haven't played for 60 days or 2 years, they open the app. Like, what do we do with this? And then the final one, and the most complicated one in our case, was secondary installs. Where by secondary installs, how we define secondary install, it's in most cases an existing DAU who acquires a new device. So you either bought a new device or you're playing on multiple devices. If you're playing multiple devices, these are usually the highest kind of engaged users, or like highest quality users. But MMPs don't really have a way to kind of reconcile this data. So in 100%, or like in a large majority of cases, these are seen as new users, but internally we see them as existing users. So what do you do with this? Is this a new user or an old user? Where do you attribute that cost? There's like a lot of challenges, or like a lot of questions that need to be answered. And then on top of that, we have an issue with misaligned attribution windows. So there's an attribution window that's defined by the MMP, meaning it's 2 years or it's infinite. And there's also an attribution window that's defined internally, and it's not based off of advertising ID. It's usually whatever it's based on re-registration window, actually, and like what is the window that you consider in a company after which, when it expires, you consider that user a new user. So some companies don't even do that. They also have infinite windows, and then they treat reattribution as reinstalls. Lots of similar definitions, which makes this really confusing. But you need to understand these really well in order to develop your reporting stack and to understand, again, what's the actual cost CPI per campaign, per install type, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of this, we have scan, which uses a completely different definition of an install. It's tied to the iTunes account. So it's not easy to reconcile these data sources and to understand really where is the highest quality user coming from, and how do we optimize our campaigns the best possible way. But why do we care? So can we just like look at all in and be like, this is the spend, this is what the revenue? Not really, because these users behave quite differently. And the difference between like a secondary install, which is in a lot of cases a payer who just plays on multiple devices, or a reinstall, which is a player who really knows the product well. So the way they move through the content is different to the way the new users move, especially in old games where new users are not necessarily golden cohorts. They're users who are coming as a result of maybe misleading ads or a different funnel, or they're just not highly targeted users, because you have to continue growing and you're kind of expanding your reach to more and more casual audiences. So this is an example of one app. I won't share which app, but essentially shows how different retention curves are between reinstalls and secondary installs and new installs. So this graph is actually 120 days. So by day 120, the retention is like 3 or 4 times worse for new installs than for reinstalls and secondary installs. This means that essentially the LTV curve looks different, the pay conversion looks different. But this also means that they're moving through the content much faster. And because they churn, this could mean that they churn sooner than the new installs. So you really need to understand these things in order to measure campaign effectiveness properly. And then the last thing, and the biggest headache for us internally, is that the revenue from these different install types gets attributed by partners, by ad networks. And internally, we don't see that revenue. So if our internal target for day 7 target for a specific game, let's say Harry Potter, puzzles and spells is 7%, and App11 is hitting 7%, they're like, we're hitting the target. It's because they're seeing 30, 40% more revenue than what we're seeing internally. So you really need to be on top of these things, understand where the revenue discrepancy is coming from in order to optimize campaigns effectively. So lots of decisions to be made. How do we treat these installs? Do we treat them all as new installs? Do we ignore them altogether and we just look at new installs? And then if we do that, what do we do with the cost? If 20% of installs are not new installs, do we split that cost among with the new users? Do we attribute it to the old cohorts, which is really hard, and it's super easy to make some cause some problems that way if you attribute cost to like old cohorts. And then the last thing is like, what do you do with the revenue that's being reported to the networks? You can go the server-to-server route and just not report it. AppsFlyer has like a delayed attribution approach like tool as well, so you could figure out ways to do this, but it's not simple. So you really need to make decisions and decide based on this data how to, again, attribute it properly and measure campaigns in a smarter way. So just to give you a sense of how big of an issue this is, and it's not a huge issue, but it's definitely worth looking into. So over time, as we started looking into these different install types, we managed to bring the new install percentage up to 97%. So most installs are actually new installs. 2% of installs are reinstalls coming from UA and retargeting campaigns. So we see them differently, like retargeting UA, because in a lot of cases, we can't really control with suppression lists whether we bring old users or not. And then 1% of installs are secondary installs. So you'd say it's not a lot. It's 1%. It's marginal. We can just ignore it. But when you look at the actual day 7 revenue contributed by these users, like secondary installs, because they're in large majority of cases payers, they generate a lot of revenue in the first 7 days because they're already playing the game. They're spending money. They just move to a different device. They continue spending the money. And then the biggest reason of why we're seeing such a high revenue discrepancy between ad networks and internal tools is essentially secondary installs. And it's super important to understand what to do with this group of users or install type. Reinstalls are not that big of don't have that big of an impact on revenue, but it's still significantly, if you look, it's 2% of installs, 4% of revenue, they do behave quite differently. You can see that they're probably 2 times better than new install. So again, you need to understand how to treat these differently and assign them the value you think it should be assigned in the UA campaigns. And what are my recommendations? They're just 2-3 more slides. It's a quick one. Maybe we'll have some time for questions. The first thing to do is just look into reattribution windows and try to align reattribution windows between the MMP and internally. This is easier said than done because MMPs, and my suggestion for MMPs, which is this is a good place to provide a suggestion, that down the road maybe they should own a DMP as well, and they should be the ones who are telling us, hey, this is a new user or an old user, and somehow merge the first-party data with the DMP data. So when we align re-registration windows, our internal reattribution window with the MMP reattribution window, this should help with discrepancies. And the one way to do that is just to make sure that you're always passing your first-party ID. I think pretty much every major developer does this. It's not a new thing, but this is the start. And once you do these things, it will help you align install and revenue reporting between the MMP, partners, and internally. Maybe you won't give credit to those networks for the revenue that they're generating from reinstalls and secondary installs, but it still gives you some information on whether certain partners are getting more credit than they should, or whether your external targets that you're sharing with them are the right ones or not. Once you understand that, then you'll also know better where the discrepancies are coming from. They are pretty annoying. It's hard sometimes to understand, again, is it the MMP? Is it the partner? Is it the internal reporting? But once you understand that, then you get a better sense of what is essentially the LTV for each of these users, or what is the CPI for each type of users. And then you can assign a specific LTV prediction model. Because if the reinstalls and secondary installs are behaving differently, they shouldn't be using the same LTV prediction model than new installs if you want to, again, hit your goals and drive the most revenue for the company. And ultimately, when you figure these all things out and have the right reporting in place, you can keep your plumbing hat on and save the princess speech from the UA discrepancies. And that would be a quick overview of different install types. And maybe you have a minute or two for questions if you guys have some. This is a quick one and just an overview of how we look at things and how we try to remove discrepancies and cause less issues on the reporting side. Thank you.